Number 10. An unfair ruling. It's no surprise that when it comes to criminals being sentenced to life in jail, they don't always take the news very well, and really, who can blame them? Someone ordering you to spend the rest of your life behind bars is a pretty good reason to freak out. But then again, the sentence is usually deserving of the crime committed. Take the case of Regina Johnson, a 60-year-old woman from San Carlos who shot her husband and daughter to death and then stayed inside their home for 3 days with the dead bodies. This was a horrendous crime, and she got a matching sentence to boot. Superior Court Judge Joan Weber sentenced her to spend 15 years to life for each murder, plus an additional charge of 25 to life for using a gun. The total was 80 years to life, and Regina flipped out. But she flipped out in a rather strange way. After lashing out at the judge and getting scolded by her attorney, she then read a letter out loud to her dead daughter, saying how much she loved her and would never hurt her despite the fact that she shot her and killed her. I mean, the whole thing's pretty bizarre, and it's important to note that her daughter was only 14 years old when she shot her in the back of the head for no apparent reason. Dang, Gina. Come on. Number 9. Serious regret. Our next freakout came from a man in Iowa who was recently sentenced to 50 years in prison after brutally beating a toddler to death. This is truly a disgusting crime with absolutely no excuse, and Dustin Armstrong got exactly what he deserved. But of course, he had some serious regret. After the sentencing was given to him in the courtroom, Armstrong lost his marbles. I mean, he was okay at first, but when he got up to leave, he spotted his mother and the rest of his family in and totally lost control. He sat down hard in his seat and began to weep uncontrollably. Now, whether he committed this crime intentionally or not, he definitely felt the horror of what he did. And that was pretty clear when he folded over himself, buried his head in his hands, and refused to get up while he bawled his eyes out. If you ask me, he's going to be doing a lot more crying throughout the rest of his life in prison, and it sounds like he definitely deserves to. Hey, real quick, if you're new to the channel, welcome and thanks for checking us out. Give this video a like and hit that subscribe button for more World List videos just like this one. Number 8. Attacked in the courtroom. Not every courtroom freakout is done by the convict. When Michael Madison was recently sentenced to die in East Cleveland courtroom after killing 3 women and then trying to dispose of their bodies by wrapping them in garbage bags, a father of one of the victims lashed out and attacked Mr. Madison. He tried to leap across the room and probably would have bludgeoned him to death if he hadn't been held back. Michael Madison was sentenced to die by lethal injection for the aggravated murders of 3 girls. And halfway through the statement from their father, he lunged at Madison. And I mean, this probably wasn't totally unexpected. After all, it must have been really difficult staring into the eyes of the man who killed his daughter without intense anger boiling up in his soul. The attacker didn't manage to get his hands on Madison, as a whole lot of deputies stepped in and ripped the man away, but he certainly tried his best. Madison was unharmed and the victim's father was escorted from the courtroom, but in the end, Michael Madison would die from lethal injection anyway. Number 7. Classic freakout. Our next freakout is a classic, but the story behind it is a little strange. It starts with the death of Jason Nyberg inside of the Minnesota Correctional Facility. Melissa then pleaded guilty to her boyfriend's murder and was sentenced to 86 months in prison, which was far above the minimum sentence that Melissa and her attorney had been hoping for. Following the sentence, Melissa had an outburst. She began to lash out at the judge, screaming that she had never meant for Jason to die and that he was her best friend, that she already felt guilty about what had happened and had no intentions of killing him. She even screamed at the judge that she had made a mistake and was not planning on murdering the love of her life. It was a huge scene, but of course, the judge was stone cold and shut her down. In the end, Melissa would be spending a significant amount of time thinking about the decision she made behind bars. Number 6. Chris McNabb. Chris McNabb was one of the most ruthless villains to pass through the justice system. Chris, along with his wife Courtney, were both sentenced to life in jail for murdering their innocent daughter who was only 2 years old. A jury deliberated for less than 1 hour before handing out the harsh sentences. Chris was convicted on 8 counts, and his girlfriend was convicted on 3 counts, one of them including murder in the 2nd degree. Chris got life without parole and an additional 10 years in case he became a zombie and still needed to be locked up. As for his girlfriend, she received 15 years in prison and 15 years of probation. After the sentencing, Chris had a little freakout. He declared to the courtroom that he was innocent, that he would never commit the crime he was charged with, and that the judge was making a huge mistake. although it was pretty hard to take Chris seriously with his face and neck covered in what appeared to be gang tattoos. Chris McNabb went on a long tirade about his innocence and told the judge that whoever really did kill his baby should get the maximum life sentence. In response, the judge gave him the maximum life sentence. Don't do the crime if you can't do the time, man. Number 5. 12 life sentences. Believe it or not, some of the best courtroom freakouts actually come from the judge, not the convict. When Dondre Shabazz was given 12 consecutive life sentences in a Fulton County courtroom, County Superior Court Judge Alfred J. Dempsey Jr. told the convict exactly what he thought of him. His exact words to the convict were, "True justice would be to put you in a room with your victims and turn them loose on you." It's a pretty bold statement to come from a judge. He also added that, of course, the law would not allow such a thing to happen, and so the worst thing that he could do to him was give him every single day in jail that he could, which resulted in 12 consecutive life sentences. This came after Mr. Shabazz was found guilty of 24 out of 25 counts of some seriously bad crimes, including sexual assault, robbery, and kidnapping. He was found guilty of sexually assaulting at least a dozen women at gunpoint throughout Atlanta between the years of 2002 and 2005. And by the way the judge freaked out on this guy, it seemed that he was close to getting out of his chair and beating the man with his own gavel. And yeah, I mean, kinda who could blame him? Number 4. Leon Montgomery. Here we have yet another man who was convicted for killing a small child. Leon Montgomery of Louisville, Kentucky, was recently convicted for the death of his son Noah, who had only been 5 months old at the time. Apparently, Leon Montgomery had beat the infant with his fist in such a brutal way that limbs were broken and bones were fractured. This guy deserved every single second of the 30-year sentence the judge passed down on him. But of course, he wasn't going to be hauled off to prison without some words of his own. After the judgment was made, which everyone on Earth can probably agree was completely justified, Montgomery then screamed profanity at the judge, telling him to eat his blank. It was clear that Montgomery had no remorse for what he had done and was more inconvenienced by the sentencing than he was upset with himself. The judge held Montgomery in contempt and then sentenced him to an extra 6 months in jail for using such foul language in the courtroom. Number 3. 99 years. If you ever find yourself on trial, I recommend refraining from an outburst. Just ask Desmond Jones how far an outburst can get you. This guy was being sentenced by a Dallas County jury for kidnapping and murdering a 13-year-old girl named Siobhan Randall. This crime was committed in 2017, and the authorities believe that it was in retaliation to a drug deal. Desmond Jones was sentenced to life in prison for his involvement in the girl's tragic murder. But during the punishment part of the trial, Jones got in a verbal argument with someone in the gallery, and the two started screaming back and forth. The judge had to order the person in the gallery to leave, and Jones had to be forced back into his seat. Then, while Jones' younger sister was trying to be a character witness for her brother, he stood up abruptly and shouted, "It don't even matter no more," and was then taken into custody and dragged out of the courtroom while screaming incoherently. At first, the sentence was going to be around 20 years to life, but after a bit of deliberation by the jury following the freakouts, they sentenced him to 99 years behind bars, ensuring that he would never get out. I guess it don't even matter no more to Jones. Number 2. 6 more years. Manson M. Bryant of Ohio had already been found guilty of aggravated robbery, abduction, aggravated burglary, carrying concealed weapons, and kidnapping. But during his sentencing trial, Manson got a little fed up with the judge and began to throw derogatory remarks at him and the rest of the court. What should have been a normal sentencing turned into an absolute nightmare for Manson, who just couldn't control himself. The judge gave him 22 years, and when Manson verbally exploded and hurled obscenities at the judge, he then received 6 more. This is kind of like the teacher adding an extra hour to your detention for talking back, only it's extra years of a man's life behind bars. Of course, Manson definitely deserved it. According to the court records, he caused massive psychological harm to the people he kidnapped. And some of his victims experienced serious economic difficulties after Manson was finished with them. The 6 extra years were definitely deserved. Number 1. Violence in the courtroom. And finally, we come to a brawl in a courtroom. 2 men were recently arrested after they attacked their mother's killer in a courtroom during the killer's trial. This happened again in Ohio, where a lot of these freakouts seem to come from. Dale Williams was to be sentenced in 2017 after he confessed to running his ex-girlfriend off the road and then shooting her to death. This was a terrible crime, and the woman he killed left behind an extremely hurt and angry family. In the courtroom, one of the woman's sons ran for Williams, sprung over a table, and attacked him. Then the other son joined the fight and it turned into a huge ballroom brawl. The sons managed to get a few shots off on the killer before they were eventually subdued with a stun gun and arrested. When being handcuffed by officers, one of the men screamed, "He killed my mother, man." And yeah, you can definitely sympathize with him. The most jarring, creepy structure discovered in recent times is actually an abandoned government facility recently discovered deep in the woods by an urban explorer and his cameraman. In a video uploaded to YouTube, the explorer stumbles onto the place in the middle of the forest and just walks right in. He never does share exactly which forest in which state the facility was found, but that might be for the best. This place is so creepy and disturbing that nobody should be venturing out into the forest looking for it. We don't know what this government facility was used for, but according to the urban explorer, it was opened in 1990 and then suddenly closed without warning in 2014. The facility closed so abruptly that many of the offices still had office equipment, personal calendars, and files sitting on the desks as if they'd all just picked up and left. But that's not even the creepiest part about this abandoned government facility. Deep in the basement, there was yellow police tape blocking off areas where it appeared as though some kind of horrifying event took place. It looked like most of the evidence had already been cleaned up, but something strange definitely happened here. The urban explorer even found a giant crate and some mysterious schematics. No one's really sure if this was a secret government lab where something went horribly wrong, or if it was simply an administrative building built in the middle of a secluded wood. What's the creepiest thing you've ever found in the woods? Have you ever stumbled upon an abandoned building? Even a shed or hunting lodge would terrify me. Tell me about your discoveries in the comments section below. Then remember to subscribe to World List if you haven't already for more amazing videos just like this one. Number 9. The Headless Toad. There's nothing quite creepier than something without a head. There's also nothing quite slimier than a toad. So when a student from the University of Massachusetts discovered an adult toad in the forest of Connecticut back in 2016, jumping around without a head, it became one of the strangest things ever found in the woods. This toad had a body that looked perfectly healthy with legs hopping all over the place. The only problem was that it had no eyes, no nose, and no tongue. It only had a small hole where its mouth should have been. The video of this freakish animal was uploaded online, and luckily some people came forward to help solve the mystery. After all, it didn't make much sense for the toad to still be alive since it had no head with which to feed. According to a wildlife veterinarian named Lydia Franklinos, the toad could have had eggs laid in it by an adult fly, and when the larvae hatched, they may have eaten the toad's flesh, including its entire head. The fact that it's still alive, though, well, that's terrifying. But how did it survive? It seems like most animals would probably die without their heads, but somehow this creature was still wandering around. It would creep me out big time to be sure. Number 8. Mummified Koala. When you think of koala bears, you probably think of cute and fuzzy animals hanging out in the trees and munching on leaves. And while this is definitely true, one person came across what can only be described as a koala nightmare deep in the woods of Australia. A mummified koala was discovered draped across a couple tree branches, blackened and shrunken in an almost sickening way. There isn't much of a backstory about this koala bear, and it's not entirely clear what caused its mummification. However, it's definitely gross. In the picture, it looks as if the koala is suspended in the trees just above some water, so it's possible that salt could have had something to do with the way it's petrified. In any case, it's definitely not a koala bear that you would want to hug. It looks slimy to touch, and it's probably full of bugs and diseases. Number 7. The Giant Web. They say everything is bigger in Texas, and this couldn't be truer. Check out these trees completely shrouded in spiderwebs. It looks like the terrifying scene from The Hobbit when Bilbo is kidnapped by the giant spider, but this is real life. The web-covered trees were discovered at Lake Twakanee State Park, about 30 miles from the town of Rolette. Apparently, spiders are able to work together to weave a type of communal web. And this was shocking to experts because they'd previously thought spiders only made webs alone. The first giant web was apparently found back in 2007, and the spiders who worked together to build this monstrosity are known as the Tetranantha guatemalensis. You have a fear of spiders, this is the last place you should ever visit. Original estimates place the number of spiders inside the enormous web at somewhere around 1,000 or more. The only good news is that according to an urban entomologist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, these spiders are not harmful to humans. But whether they're harmful or not, walking into a web filled with thousands of them is enough to give even the bravest soul a giant heart attack. Number 6. The Hanging Coffins. There's nothing quite as creepy as coming upon a burial ground deep inside the forest. If you were to visit the Philippines and wander into the wrong part of the woods, you might be shocked to discover a collection of hanging coffins nailed to the side of a cliff face. And yes, these coffins are filled with bodies and bones. Rather than being placed inside of the ground like a normal burial, the Sagada people of the Philippines hang their coffins in the air in a bizarre ritual that's been going on for over 2,000 years. So bizarre to us, but probably not bizarre to them. Apparently, these ancient people believed that if their dead are hung inside of coffins above the ground, there's a greater chance that their spirits will reach the afterlife. Many of the coffins were found throughout this mountainous region, which is about a 12-hour bus ride from Manila. But of course, you're not actually allowed to climb up and inspect the coffins. If you were to ever make the journey through the forest to this place, it's recommended that you bring binoculars and observe the creepy spectacle from a respectful distance. Number 5. Hot pink slugs. It's time that we added yet another creepy animal found in the deep woods of Australia to the long and seemingly endless list of creepy animals found in the woods of Australia. But rather than talking about a venomous spider or a venomous snake, let's take a look at a hot pink slug. We already know that snakes and spiders rule the outback of Australia, but apparently a hot pink slug was recently discovered by a park ranger in the territory of New South Wales. This slug is ridiculously big, growing to about 8 inches in length. But what's even more incredible is that these creepy slime bags are only located in a small subalpine area of about 4 square miles. These slugs feed on moss and mold, and the reason they're bright pink isn't just to creep you out, it's so they can blend in with the eucalyptus leaves, which turn red as they fall from their branches. What's really cool is that this small area where the slugs live is home to other ancient species that existed thousands and thousands of years ago when all of Australia was blanketed in rainforest. And while it's still cool, you definitely wouldn't want to touch one of these massive slimy slugs, especially seeing as how they're probably the size of half your arm. Number 4. The skull from 1986. Let's take a trip back in time to August 2nd of 1986. It was on this day that 2 workers with the Forest Service discovered a partial skull, a handful of bone fragments, and a tooth near a government camp in the woods of Oregon. The workers handed the skull over to the local authorities, and the Oregon State Police forensic examiner claimed that the skull had been lost inside of the forest for about 10 years, and that the skull belonged to either a man or a woman in their late 20s. But here's where the story of the skull from 1986 gets extremely creepy. In 2005, the Clackamas County Medical Examiner's Office re-inspected the skull. Still, there were no leads. It wouldn't be until 2019, when the skull was shipped to the University of North Texas, that progress was finally made. Researchers discovered her name and her birth date. It turns out that the skull discovered in 1986 belonged to a woman named Wanda Ann Herr, who had gone missing in June of 1976. Considering this case is around 40 years old, it's really unlikely to be solved anytime soon, but it was still a pretty creepy thing to find in the forest. What's even creepier is that according to local Oregon news, there are currently 163 unidentified remains, all of them skeletal, still active in the state. Number 3. Creepy phone booth. A lot less creepy than old bones is the random phone booth that was found sitting in the middle of the woods somewhere in the United Kingdom. Nobody has any clue how this telephone booth wound up rusting away in the middle of a patch of trees, but the story of how it got there is pretty wild. The telephone box definitely didn't work at the time the photo was taken, and it was definitely pretty old. The image was posted on Reddit, and someone pointed out that this model of telephone booth is known as a K6 model, designed by Sir Giles Gilbert Scott and introduced in 1936, crafted from concrete and glass. However, these telephone booths were mostly replaced in 1985. And that means that whoever placed it in the woods probably did so quite a long time ago. But the real question here is, what were they doing with it in the forest? Was someone sleeping in the thing? Was it involved perhaps in a creepy murder? Or is there some backwoods Superman using it to change into his uniform? Whatever the answer is, I'm pretty sure it's disturbing. Number 2. The ruins of Nazis. Deep in the remote Argentine jungle, a creepy Nazi hideout may have just been discovered. These ruins were found in a horrible state of degradation, located inside the Teuqueri Park in the north of the country. Researchers from the University of Buenos Aires told local news that they found 5 German coins, each of them minted sometime between 1938 and 1941. They also discovered a fragment of a porcelain plate inscribed with "Made in Germany." Of course, all the signs point to this dilapidated ruin having once been used by the Germans at the time. And this isn't really that surprising, considering that after the defeat of the Germans in the Second World War, many of the richest members of the Nazi Party fled to Argentina to avoid prosecution. And it looks like one of their sites has just been discovered. But how long any of these evil people lived in these 3 crumbling buildings is still a mystery. Yet another mystery is when these secret bunkers were built. It's long been said that high-ranking officers in 1940s Germany had secret projects scattered across the world, deep in jungles, high up in the mountains, and even in the deserts. This could very well have been one of their hidden bases built even before the war. Number 1. Stone and smoke. Usually if you see a chimney, it's attached to a house, usually inside of the living room of the house. And yet deep inside the woods of Maine, just outside of Bangor, a couple stumbled upon the creepy remnants of a stone fireplace and no evidence that it had ever belonged to a house. According to the couple themselves, they had wandered a little bit off the trail when they came across the creepy landmark, and the couple was understandably creeped out by what they found, so they went in search of a local historian to see if they could get more information about the chimney. As it turned out, there had once been an old cabin in the forest, but it had burned down a very long time ago. It had allegedly been lived in by foreigners from Finland, who had actually carved the chimney from granite by hand. What exactly happened to the Finnish people living in their remote cabin when it burned down is still unknown, but the fact that their chimney remains standing today to creep out hikers is still kind of amazing. Out of all the ways people have died, one of the dumbest has to be from a giant fake rat. A giant rat prop, along with at least 44,000 pounds of other trash, was discovered blocking a drainage system in a neighborhood of Mexico City. While this normally wouldn't really be that big an issue, the giant rat and the 20 tons of garbage actually caused the drainage system to back up, which flooded the neighborhood during an uncommonly intense rainstorm in the month of September. Because the drain was blocked and the rain was coming down so hard, the neighborhood flooded and caused a 54-year-old woman to get trapped inside of her apartment. The water flowed into her unit, caused her furniture to block the door, and trapped her inside while she drowned. Her body was later discovered by a neighbor after realizing that the woman was not with the other residents who had gathered outside after having to abandon their homes. While this definitely wasn't the woman's fault, it's still a pretty silly way to go. After the flood, most residents were able to return to their homes. The authorities unblocked the drainage system and the giant fake rat was disposed of. It's believed that the rat and other garbage ended up inside of the drainage system after being dumped into the nearby river instead of being disposed of properly. This is one reason you should never throw your garbage bags into the river. You might accidentally drown an old lady. Number 9. Death by beard. Hans Steininger was a mayor of a small town in Austria long ago, and regardless of his town's more recent history, the most absurd thing about it was Hans, who had a rather impressive beard. He lived in 1567 and was an extremely popular mayor. We don't actually know much about his life, but we do certainly know a lot about his death. One day, Hans was killed by his 4.5-foot beard. Usually, Hans kept his facial hair rolled up and tucked inside of his pocket, and this makes sense considering it was so long that it normally trailed on the ground in front of him, and the mayor didn't want anyone to trip over it. Unfortunately, on September 28th, that's exactly what happened to Hans. A fire broke out in his town, there was widespread panic, and while trying to calm his citizens down, Hans tripped over his beard, fell down a full flight of stairs, and broke his neck. This is the most ridiculous way to die, killed by your own beloved beard, but that's exactly how it happened. Today, Hans's beard is locked inside a glass case inside the historical museum of the town, ensuring that everyone in the world can come to view this legendary beard of Hans. It's even being chemically preserved so it will last for centuries to come, and it's already been there for 450 years. So what's the biggest beard you've ever seen? Was it on a Santa Claus impersonator or perhaps a wise old priest, imam, or rabbi? Tell me about it in the comments below. And then remember to subscribe to World List for more incredible videos just like this one. Number 8. Crushed by an elephant. Imagine getting lost in the forest. That's a scary enough concept in itself. There are ghosts, Sasquatches, and who knows what else lurking in the woods. But when a 47-year-old man was grazing his cattle and wandered accidentally into the forest area near his home in India, he ended up being trampled to death by an elephant. It all happened because the man took his cattle grazing inside of a special protected forest home to some of the nation's most prized wild elephants. If you know anything about elephants, you will know that they can be highly aggressive. You may also know that elephants are pretty big and not something you want to be trampled by. According to local authorities, this was not even the first dumb death to occur in the region because of an elephant. A forest watcher was also killed recently by an elephant in a nearby forest, and so was the forest watcher's wife. It turns out these wild elephants have a penchant for murder, and if you're dumb enough to wander alone into their forest and into their territory, nobody can be responsible for you being trampled into a puddle of muck. After all, the elephants are just trying to defend their homes. Because of humans slowly moving into the few remaining bastions for these wild animals, authorities expect more trampling deaths to occur as we move into the future. Number 7. Coconut apocalypse. Perhaps one of the most dangerous and unknown objects in the world is the deadly coconut. A man in the small central Colombian town of Melgar learned this the hard way when he was murdered by a rogue coconut after it smashed him in the head. Of course, the coconut wasn't rolling around on its own when it happened. The man was reportedly relaxing in a spot of shade when the coconut dislodged from the tree, fell onto the man's head, and killed him pretty much instantly. A neighbor witnessed the entire incident and called for help, but even though the man was whisked quickly to the hospital, he still sadly died. He had been 69 years old when he was killed by the coconut and on his property nonetheless. According to the autopsy, the coconut caused a severe injury to the man's skull and brain, which both resulted in a nearly immediate death. The only real good news about this is that the man probably didn't feel much in the way of pain. He, in all likelihood, didn't even know what happened. Number 6. Chugging to death. There's a very good reason that your mother warned you about the dangers of alcohol. Not only is alcohol wildly dangerous to drink in excess, seeing as it's basically poison, but alcohol can also result in death because of dumb decisions. A great example of this is a man who recently died because of a drinking contest gone wrong. It all happened at a beach resort in Thailand when a man collapsed to the floor after chugging a full pint of beer. The guy had been competing in a drinking contest with his co-workers when disaster struck. His co-workers could do nothing except look on in horror as the man raised his glass in victory, then fell to the floor and began to have a seizure. Beer was foaming out of his nose and mouth and he was quickly taken to the hospital. Unfortunately, the man did not survive the incident. According to the report from the Daily Mail, authorities were not able to determine the cause of death without an autopsy. It was unclear if the man had alcohol poisoning, if he had some kind of allergic reaction to the beer, or if something else was at play. It's a little unusual for a single pint of beer to kill a person, but that's just the kind of crazy thing that can happen when you're partying in Thailand. Number 5. Cactus revenge. When you think about somebody being killed by a cactus, it's hard to imagine how such a thing could really happen. Did the cactus stab somebody to death? Did somebody try to eat a cactus only to be poisoned? And the answer is neither. This next story is about instant karma, about a cactus that took vengeance on a guy who shot it and impaled him with its spikes. But how did such a horrifying thing happen? To understand a bit more about how a cactus can impale a man, we have to take a trip to southern Arizona, where they have giant cacti known as saguaros with huge spikes and extremely long arms. According to Snopes, these cacti can grow over 60 feet tall, and yes, they can kill. In 1982, two friends packed up their guns and went to Arizona desert to have a bit of fun shooting. One of the fellas thought it would be fun to blast some cacti with his shotgun. He found a huge saguaro and stood about 10 feet away from it, blasted a couple holes into its giant trunk with his shotgun, and then the cactus fell forward directly on top of him. Kind of like a really dumb lumberjack being crushed by the tree he had just cut down. In this case, the cactus literally crushed him and impaled the guy with its huge spikes, killing him instantly. But even though this guy died, his ridiculous story will be immortalized forever, especially in the state of Arizona. Number 4. Reaching for the moon. Li Bai was a Chinese poet who lived between 701 and 762. Back in his day, he was revered as a poetic genius and a popular figure of romance. He was one of the most influential people in the golden age of Chinese poetry. But even for such a romantic guy, he died in the oddest possible way. He wrote around 1,000 poems, and he was married at least 4 times. He had many children, and he died trying to reach the moon. This happened in the final year of his life, 762, after getting incredibly intoxicated. So far as the legend go, Li Bai was relaxing on his boat late at night when he got so ridiculously drunk that he tried to hug the moon. Of course, seeing as he was on the Yangtze River and the moon was out in space, this didn't work out very well for the poet. In his attempt to get his hands on the moon, he lost his balance and tipped over the edge of his boat and drowned. Of course, there's a lot of historical speculation as to whether this story is true or not. The legend has certainly given Li Bai a prominent place in Chinese culture, though many historians believe that he never actually drowned trying to hug the moon, but that he in fact died of natural causes because of the hard lifestyle of drinking and traveling. Number 3. Raw cookie dough. A woman named Linda Rivera died just recently because of one of the most peculiar reasons imaginable. According to a report from ABC News, the woman died 4 years after eating a couple spoonfuls of raw cookie dough that were later discovered to be contaminated with a deadly strain of E. coli. It took 4 years for those scoops of raw cookie dough to kill the woman. Her kidneys stopped functioning. She later went into septic shock, and over the next 4 years, she became sicker and sicker. Her organs failed one by one. She was in and out of hospitals for various operations, and eventually she just couldn't take it anymore. Rivera finally died in 2013 because of medical complications surrounding the E. coli she had been infected with many years earlier. Of course, there's a lot more going on in this case than meets the eye. Linda experienced an exceptional reaction to the E. coli that caused her to get sicker than normal. She suffered a brain injury. She had to have many parts of her large intestines removed, and she was even put on a ventilator for months at a time. She was really very sick. But regardless of how sick she was, we can still blame the raw cookie dough. The woman actually made claims against the company that produced the cookie dough that killed her, which caused Nestle to recall the product in 2009 after dozens of other cases of E. coli poisoning. Number 2. First human killed by robot. Just try to imagine being the first human ever killed by a robot. That's gotta be kind of an embarrassing title to have, and guess what? That title goes to a guy from Flat Rock, Michigan. His name was Robert Williams, and he was the first man to ever be killed by a robot. Everyone knows that robots are a danger to the human race. Perhaps a system like Skynet will take over, probably by 2025, and murder all of us humans. But it all started in 1979 thanks to Robert. He was working on an assembly line at the Ford Motor Plant when he was gathering parts inside of the storage facility. However, there was a robot there also retrieving parts. The robot accidentally slammed into Robert, killing him instantly. You know, of course the robot wasn't malicious about its murder. It was really just trying to do its job, and the stupid human got in its way. The case was actually brought to court, where a jury claimed it was not the robot's fault at all. Instead, the jury said the man's death was because of a lack of safety measures, and they awarded Robert's family $10 million in damages. Number 1. Toilet hazard. Get ready to have your socks knocked off by the weirdest and most ridiculous deaths that happen every single year. According to research from the Japanese city of Tokyo, roughly 10,000 people every year in Japan die while sitting on the toilet. That is way more deaths than someone would expect, especially from a single country. The reason this happens is that in Japan, central heating is not a luxury that everyone can afford. Plus, many times the rooms with the toilets in them are not heated at all. This means that in the winter, some toilets in Japan are incredibly cold. When someone sits on the toilet to use it, a few things will happen that trigger death. There's a shift in temperature, a rise in blood pressure, and sometimes a lot of straining. All of these things mix together to create heart failure, which results in around 10,000 people allegedly being found dead on the toilet in Japan every single year. How bizarre. This unique story is about a man from Brazil named Gilberto, who was initially pronounced dead in 2012 after his body was mistakenly identified at the local morgue by none other than his own brother. Assuming that it was Gilberto who had been murdered, a funeral service was put together. However, halfway through the funeral, while his family and friends were standing beside his coffin and mourning over him, he showed up at the door. It turned out that he wasn't dead at all and that somebody else had been murdered. The thing is, Gilberto worked as a car washer in a rural town, and it just so happened that another car washer who worked in the exact same town and looked identical to Gilberto had been murdered. The brothers' confusion over the identification of Gilberto's body wasn't that shocking, seeing as the two men could have really been twins. But perhaps the most shocking part of all is that the two men had no knowledge of each other, even though they looked so much alike and they lived in the same town doing the exact same jobs. Suffice it to say, it was a huge relief to Gilberto's family when he showed up at his own funeral. Number 9. Waking up in a body bag. There's nothing worse than waking up inside of a body bag after being declared dead, but that's exactly what happened to a man in Mississippi named Walter Williams, who came back to life after being pronounced deceased at the ripe old age of 78. After being declared dead and stuffed inside of a body bag on February 26th, Walter was transported to a funeral home and then taken to the embalming room, where morticians were about to go through the post-death procedures. However, before they could get to work, they realized Walter wasn't dead. His legs began to move, he started to kick, and the morticians saw he was still breathing. They quickly called an ambulance and paramedics arrived to hook Walter up to monitors to see just what was going on. Sure enough, the man had a heartbeat. He was transported back to the hospital and was released several days later, still alive. Unfortunately, according to CNN, Walter died just 2 weeks after he was resurrected. Paramedics came to pick him up early in the morning after his nephew found him unresponsive, and this time they made sure that Walter was 100% dead before he was transported back to the funeral home. For Walter's family, the extra 2 weeks between his two deaths was a miracle, and they cherished every last minute of it. So what would you do if you had an extra 2 weeks with your grandparents or great-grandparents who have passed away? Would you try and do something exciting like a big trip, or just relax and listen to their stories? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to World List for more incredible videos just like this one. Number 8. Staged funeral. It's one thing to wake up at your own funeral, but it's another thing altogether to plan a fake funeral for yourself just to see how many people would turn up. And that's exactly what a man in China named Zhang Diang did. He was 66 years old when he decided to stage an elaborate funeral for himself. This man had never been married, he had never had any children, and he was particularly worried that when he eventually did die, nobody would come to visit his grave, which is a very serious concern in Chinese culture. To make sure he would at least have some mourners to attend his grave when he was finally placed inside of it, he went ahead and faked his own death. At the staged funeral, at least 40 people showed up who were invited, plus a few hundred others whom he didn't invite. But even though hundreds of strangers and dozens of friends showed up to his funeral, the man still was unhappy. At least 20 of his friends and family members ignored the invitation to his funeral and they didn't make it. At the end of the day, he was very upset that a handful of his relatives and friends didn't care about him enough to attend his funeral. But this should really be a lesson to everyone. If you don't want to be disappointed by your funeral attendance, well, don't hold a fake funeral. Sometimes it's better to just not know. Number 7. Rude awakening. It's time to meet the man who literally woke up at his own funeral ceremony just minutes before he was to be buried. This happened in India, when mourners showed up to the funeral of a young man only 20 years old who had recently been declared dead by medical professionals. According to Fox News, he was immediately brought into the hospital and placed on a ventilator. But just how on earth did a living man end up being declared deceased and nearly buried alive? Well, it all started after a mysterious accident. The man was knocked unconscious and then kept alive at the hospital using machines until the doctors declared him dead. But here's where things get ugly. It turns out that the hospital declared the man dead only after his family revealed to them that they no longer had the funds to pay for his care. The family had initially given the hospital around $10,000 to keep the man alive, but they quickly ran out of money. Considering what happened next, when the man's limbs began to move at his own funeral and he basically rose from the dead, probably traumatizing the entire funeral party, the chief medical officer of this city in India has since launched an investigation into the medical practices of this particular private hospital. Hopefully this kind of horrifying incident never happens again. Nobody deserves to wake up at their own funeral. Number 6. Denied entry. Imagine suffering a horrible death and then being banned from attending your own funeral. This sounds like the ridiculous plot of a bad comedy movie, but it's something that happened in real life. After Chi Lewis, a 29-year-old man who was shot and killed in Trinidad back in November, arrived at his funeral seated in a chair instead of laying in a coffin, he was banished from his own service. This absolutely bizarre turn of events ended up with everyone attending the service except for the actual corpse of the guy who was dead. But things get even crazier if you can believe that. The man's body was placed outside of the St. John Evangelist Church like some kind of horrifying sculpture from a wax museum, seeing that he wasn't allowed inside and there wasn't much else that could immediately be done with the body. According to the report from the Daily Mail, some of the people walking into the church didn't even recognize the deceased. After all, he was wearing sunglasses and a suit. They thought the corpse was a guest attending the funeral and harassed him for not wearing a mask to prevent the spread of COVID-19. But of course, it's highly unlikely he could have spread the virus, seeing as he was already dead. Number 5. Death at a funeral. Prepare to be absolutely shocked by this next story. As grieving relatives slowly filed past a woman's casket at her funeral, she woke up. This is a very real case of waking up at your own funeral. It happened to a 49-year-old woman in Russia who had been declared dead by doctors after she suffered a heart attack at home and collapsed from chest pain. But like we've already learned today, being declared dead doesn't really mean much. While her family looked upon her supposed corpse, the woman woke up and began screaming. She quickly realized where she was, and here's where the story gets really crazy. The woman woke up and screamed, then went into shock when she realized she was about to be buried. The woman was rushed right back to the hospital, but she only lived for 12 minutes inside the intensive care unit before dying once more. This time, the woman died for good. It's unclear how she managed to die and come back to life only to die again, but at least we heard the hospital was carrying out an investigation. Number 4. Hitmen with hearts. You may have heard the story of Noella Rakundo, who became extremely famous across the world in 2016. As a permanent resident of Australia, Noella had gone back to her home country of Burundi to attend the funeral ceremony of a family member. This is really normal enough, except for the fact that her husband had hired hitmen to kill her while she was attending the funeral. During the service, the hitmen kidnapped Noella with the intent to do the deed. But unlike the hitmen you see in the movies, these guys actually had a conscience. After they were informed that this was the woman's husband who had ordered the hit, they decided to give Noella a break, and luckily her freedom as well. They let her go, she flew home, and then things got absolutely insane. While Noella was away, her husband had planned her funeral, assuming that the hitman had pulled off the job while Noella was in Burundi. But according to the BBC, Noella showed up at her own funeral and confronted her husband about his plan to murder her. This is one murder-for-hire plot that did not go the way it was planned. Noella's husband was arrested and then sentenced to spend 9 years in prison. Not only did Noella avoid her own funeral, but she also got revenge on the evil man who had tried to kill her. Number 3. A hastily concluded death. This next funeral story goes back to 1896, when the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Bishop of Lesbos became sick in his bed. He was a very old man, already 80 years old when he took ill. He was bedridden for several days before the physicians declared him deceased. As is tradition, the dead bishop was immediately clothed in the proper vestments and placed upon the metropolitan throne inside the legendary Church of Methmony. For all of the next day, the bishop's fresh corpse was exposed to the faithful, who came to pay their respects. Crowds flocked to the church to see the bishop's corpse, only he wasn't dead. In front of dozens of witnesses, the bishop rose from his seat, seemingly resurrected. People screamed in horror, there was general panic, and as you can imagine, the not-quite-dead bishop created quite a scene. Apparently, the old man had never actually died. Instead, he had become so lethargic from his sickness that he had fallen into a death-like state. The doctors had simply been incompetent and concluded him to be dead a little too hastily. But what's really shocking is that if this man had not been a bishop, well, he wouldn't have been sitting on a throne for a full day to be ogled at. Any normal person in those days would have been buried within 12 hours after death. In the bishop's case, he would have been buried alive. And if he had somehow crawled out of the grave, everyone would have just thought he was a vampire and then probably killed him anyway. Number 2. Waking up in the casket. Imagine dying after going to the dentist for a routine root canal. It's probably every person's worst nightmare, I know it's mine. The dentist is kind of frightening enough as it is without needing to worry about dying, but unfortunately, a young man from the Peruvian city of Tingo Maria had such a thing happen to him. After a root canal operation, the boy began to experience dangerous flu-like symptoms such as fever and chills. This went for a little while until he was eventually pronounced dead by doctors. A wake was held for the boy, the family mourned, and then in the middle of the funeral, the boy appeared to wake up inside of his casket. The doctor arrived, claimed that the boy was indeed still living, and he was swiftly transferred to a nearby hospital. But things didn't quite go the way the family had hoped. At the hospital, the young man was confirmed to be dead yet again. Nobody had any idea what had happened. But according to The Independent, the family of the young man claimed that he was sedated by the drugs used during the dental operation. And this is what tricked the doctors into thinking he was dead. But unfortunately, the boy was still dead at the end of the day and still needed to be buried. Number 1. Old Man's Day. The town of Baffin in the United Kingdom celebrates a very unusual holiday, known locally as Old Man's Day. And it's all because of one guy who narrowly escaped being buried alive. According to the legends, on October 2nd of 1571, while a funeral procession made its way to St. Mary's Church, one of the people holding the coffin of Matthew Wall, a farmer who had recently been found dead, slipped on some leaves and fell down. When the man fell, the coffin fell with him, and it hit the ground. The man dusted himself off, but he went to pick the coffin back up, and something strange happened. It turned out that Matthew was banging on the coffin from the inside. The coffin hitting the ground must have woken Matthew from his coma, and he immediately realized he was stuck inside of his own deathbed, banged on the lid for dear life, and of course was saved by all those in attendance. And what's really exceptional is that Matthew went on to get married and live for another 24 years. As for how he'd been pronounced dead at all, he probably just fell into a very deep coma. After all, this was 1571. The town of Baffin continues to celebrate Old Man's Day every year, ringing the church bells to commemorate Matthew Wall's miraculous survival. And why not? It's not every day that someone wakes up from their own funeral procession just moments before being buried alive. What would your reaction be if you woke up at your own funeral? I mean, me? I'd probably freak out. What about you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back soon for another unbelievable video.